In my last video where I was exposing these Sanhedrin members as planning a genocide of not only Christians and Muslims, but also of their fellow Jewish people, they said that they wanted to take all of those people that are not worshiping the way they are and eliminate them. And this brings to mind some things that I've read about Nazi Germany. But this is going to startle you that HAARETZ News had reported this on February 10th of 2023. Israel's government has neo-Nazi ministers. It really does recall Germany in 1933. Holocaust historian Daniel Blattman says he is astounded at how quickly Israel is hurtling towards fascism. The moment that judicial reform passes, we will be in another reality, he says. Another article states, neo-Nazis in Israel. Is Netanyahu's government following in Hitler's footsteps? I played you that clip of the head of the Nascent Sanhedrin, Yisrael Ariel, who created the Temple Institute, stating that they would eliminate the rest of the Jews worldwide that were not following the ways that they want them to follow. And he was very specific about that, also of burning down the churches and taking the spires and the crosses off the churches and burning them to the ground. Also speaking this about the Arabs.
אין אסלאם, המסגדים והצריכים של הנוצרים, הצדדים יורדים, ועכשיו בשלבים של המתזונן. זה תפקידו של מלך המשיח. להביא את העולם כולו למציאות של המצוות. אז זה לא עניין למשפטים, זה עניין לביצוע. פשוטו כמשמעות. ולכן אומר הרמב"ם, שאם אתה פוגש בן אדם ברחוב, שאיננו שומר של המצוות, אתה נתקף ואומר, אם יש לנו כוח, אתה צריך להרוג אותו, אתה צריך להרוג ליד. אם אתה תופס את דבר ברחוב, ואתה אומר לו, אתה שומר של המצוות, וכן הלאה. סליחה? בשביל זה יש רמב"ם. בשביל זה יש רמב"ם. אם אחד מאיים עליך להרוס אותך, אז קם להורגך, שכם להורגו, אתה וקולע.
Rabbi Eliezer Castiel, and this is what he has to say to his students. Due to the abolition of legal slavery, there are now deficiencies since no one is responsible for the property, right? Humans' property. With the help of God, it will return. Slavery will return. So who are going to be these slaves? Well, the non-Jews will want to be our slaves, he says. Being the slave of a Jew is the best. They must be slaves. They want to be slaves. Instead of wandering the streets, being foolish and violent, harming one another, now his life begins. Okay, so we move on. Here's another rabbi, Giora Redler, and what he teaches, takes a different tack. What he'll have to say is about the Holocaust. He says, the Holocaust wasn't really about killing the Jews. That's not the Holocaust. Okay, so what is the Holocaust? All those excuses that it was ideological or systematic, that's nonsense. Because it was out of ideology, in a way, it was more moral than if it was just people just murdering, right? Humanism, the whole secular culture of believing in man, that is the Holocaust, he says. The real Holocaust is to be pluralistic, to believe in man. That is called Holocaust. Wow. For many years already, God has been screaming that the diaspora is over, but people don't listen to him. And that is their disease, which must be cured by the Holocaust. Wow. So Jewish people living anywhere in the world other than the state of Israel, that's a disease And the cure for this disease is to genocide said Jews. Wow.
On February 19th, HAARETZ published an interview with Daniel Blattman, a professor at the Institute for Modern Jews at the Hebrew University, in which he referred to the clash of forces within Israel and the possibility that Israel would continue to undermine democracy. Blattman said he predicted in 2017, when Benjamin Netanyahu was still under investigation for only cases 1,000 and 2,000, that the judiciary would eventually be destroyed in order to help him stay in power. Blattman said that Israel today is precisely at that breaking point where corrupt politicians and convicted criminals understand that if they do not undermine the independence of the judiciary, they will not be able to remain in office, and the court will expel them, as happened with Aryeh, leader of the right-wing Shas party, or Shas movement, or end up in prison, which is Netanyahu's great nightmare. Their goal is to get rid of the judicial system, thereby ensuring their rule and political power. Blattman wrote for HAARETZ about 6 years ago an article that looks like it could have been written these days. Blattman said that he is not really optimistic about the possibility that the Israeli occupation will continue to function properly in its conclusion. I argued that the judiciary would eventually be destroyed in order to help Netanyahu stay in power, Blattman said to HAARETZ. And he also said that Israel is deteriorating into a situation where the entire judicial system is being distorted to serve one person in power at the expense of democratic stability and the democratic system in Israel. And he imagined that Netanyahu would be a leader building an image of himself as a person above the law and above the traditional standards of judicial equality for all citizens. According to Blattman, populism divides society into two opposing groups, the people and the elites. Populism is a political system that can lead to fascism or to other types of authoritarian regimes that we know from history, not necessarily Nazism, that people always focus on, but military dictatorships like the one in South America. Besides those which divide society into two categories, with me or against me. With me means being with the leader in his struggle against the elites, as this leader embodies discrimination, exclusion, and distance from centers of power that are controlled by elites. By the way, the most terrible dictatorships of the 20th century are the ones that did not send people to prisons and concentration camps. They were characterized by admiration for the leader, like Stalin and Hitler, who were popular leaders until a certain point, and something about populism is similar to the Israeli model, he added. Surely people in the Likud think, after all, that his IQ is the 6th highest in the world or something, Blattman said sarcastically. If the Knesset passes a law stating that gifts from friends worth less than $100,000 are not corruption, but legitimate gifts, Netanyahu will be free of charge from cases he has been on charge with. So there's something that comes as quite a shock, because you'll never learn this in American history, but it's reported that the Jews who fought for Nazi Germany, some of them were high-ranking Nazi officers of Jewish descent. Traitors or survivors, cowards or brave men, fools or wise, heeders of Jewish parables on the sanctity of each individual life by Ellen Feldman. So this is written by a Jewish woman in 2020. She shows a picture of the highly decorated Helmut Wilberg, a German officer of Jewish ancestry. He was the last general of the Luftwaffe during the Second World War. What was the safest place for a Jew in Hitler's Germany? A cellar or an attic? A forest? At home with a well-connected Aryan spouse? The answer was in Hitler's military. In the Wehrmacht, the Kriegsmarine, or the Luftwaffe, at least until the tide of the war turned and all three began to suffer staggering losses. Some said the Luftwaffe was the best bet because Göring protected his own. Whichever branch, wearing a uniform was like slipping into a coat of armor or invisibility. I made this astonishing discovery while delving into the literature of the war and the Nazi occupation of France for my novel, Paris Never Leaves You. According to Hitler's Jewish Soldiers by Brian Mark Rigg, thousands of full Jews and more than 100,000 part Jews joined the military of the Third Reich. The stories of these men and of the psychological as well as the physical hazards they endured altered the book I had originally set out to write. And this is from the mouth of the author, Feldman. Some of the Jewish men who fought in Hitler's military had been drafted. Others were patriots whose fathers and grandfathers and uncles had served in the Imperial Army in World War I and dutifully enlisted. One survivor described himself as a German first and a Jew second. Jewish allegiance to Germany in the early days of the Third Reich is one of the great unrequited love stories of history. Many of these Jews believed the Nuremberg racial laws and the rising tide of anti-Semitism did not apply to them. They were not Ostjuden, whom they perceived as uneducated and superstitious. German Jews were cultured. They were patriotic. Many could trace their roots in Germany back for generations, and one officer who served in the Waffen-SS was the descendant of Jews who had fled the Inquisition and settled in Germany 4 centuries earlier. Some German Jews even tried to halt the influx of their co-religionists fleeing the persecution and pogroms of Eastern Europe for fear that the presence of these unassimilated Jews would undermine their own social standing. But to Hitler, a Jew was a Jew. It didn't matter where he came from or how well educated he was, what he wore, how or when or if he even worshipped. In April of 1940, the directive came down to purge the military of all Jewish blood. Jews and part Jews, Mischlinge to the Nazis, Mampa among themselves after a cocktail popular in Berlin at the time that was half sweet and half bitter, were told to turn themselves in, and many did. Some commanding officers told their Jewish soldiers to remain quiet and go on as they were. The officers wanted their best and most experienced men for the imminent invasion of Western and Northern Europe. World conquest trumped racial purity, and one Gentile lieutenant, a member of the Nazi Party and the SA, who tried unsuccessfully to save one of his half-Jewish soldiers, was incredulous that the Wehrmacht would drum a man with an iron cross out of its ranks. A few Jewish soldiers who were forced to leave were thrown farewell parties and sent off by their colleagues, with the wistful comment that the departing soldier was a lucky so-and-so to be getting out of it. One such soldier, who was envied by his colleagues, took a darker view of matters, and he had a fairly good idea of the future he faced with roundups, work camps, and concentration camps. How did those Jewish men rationalize serving a regime that was out to destroy them and their families? How did they justify masquerading as Aryans? The second question is easier to answer than the first. Most of them, especially those who were only part Jewish, didn't feel as if they were masquerading at all. Even those whose Jewish parent had remained Jewish had often been brought up as Christians. They did not identify as Jewish. They knew nothing of Jewish practices or observance, custom, or law. They had married Gentiles and were raising their own children as Christians. For many of them, the discovery of Jewish blood came as a shock, and not a pleasant one. It would be easy to raise the cry of self-hating Jews, but discovering an unexpected persona can unsettle the most grounded or decent human being, especially when the penalty for this uninvited guest could be death. A half-Jewish officer whose maternal grandparents had converted to Christianity for economic and social reasons and baptized their daughters, learned about his Jewish ancestry only at the age of 18 when his mother confessed, and he felt as if his entire world had been turned upside down. Previously confident of himself and his heritage, he suddenly felt like a member of an inferior species. Some of the disgruntled applied for special dispensation. Hitler could make anyone an Aryan by fiat, and he did just that with the Michelinist Field Marshal Erhard Milch, General der Flieger Helmut Wilberg, and others who provided their military value. One photograph of Wilberg shows him resplendent in uniform, with no fewer than 12 medals pinned to his proud Aryan, formerly half-Jewish chest. Nonetheless, despite Wilberg's altered religious status, he insisted that he fought not for the Führer, but for the fatherland and Volk. The distinction was a common refrain among Hitler's Jewish military men, and some Aryans as well. But what of the Jews who served in Hitler's military and not only identified as Jewish but remained observant? Many of them, like another Waffen-SS officer, continued to say prayers and observe other rituals secretly in the barracks, or more desperately on the battlefield. How did they justify fighting for a regime that was taking away their rights, murdering their families, labeling them subhuman? Some believed that they could save their families by serving. One Mischlinge told of going to a Gestapo jail to help his Jewish father, only to learn that the man had been sent to Dachau. And then he volunteered in the Wehrmacht, hoping he would help his father's plight, and it didn't. Two brothers whose Gentile father had divorced their Jewish mother when the racial laws were promulgated made a point of wearing their uniforms when they visited her. She was nonetheless sent to a camp. Some salved their consciences with self-delusion. Nazi ideology was one thing, but surely their fellow soldiers who wore the same uniform and had the same needs and fears, instincts and feelings must have an essentially human heart beating beneath that uniform. Surely they would not mistreat and murder their fellow soldiers, mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, grandparents. The Waffen-SS officer whose family went back 400 years in Germany called his comrades the best anyone could want in war, though he added if they'd known he had Jewish blood, they would have strung him up from the nearest tree. National World War II Museum.org says, an architect of terror, Heinrich Himmler and the Holocaust. In 1945, one of history's most notorious figures committed suicide by ingesting cyanide. Heinrich Himmler, known for his role in the implementation of the final solution, is remembered today for his heinous acts across Europe during World War II. Heinrich Himmler was born on October 7, 1900, to a middle-class family in Munich, Germany. In his early life, he had a strong desire to join the army, but World War I ended soon after he came of age to join the military, and restrictions placed on the German army in the Treaty of Versailles dismissed any chance of a military career. Instead, Himmler turned his focus to agriculture and began studying for his degree at the Technical University of Munich. While attending the university, Himmler joined a German nationalist student group where he began to read racist and nationalistic literature. Due to the political climate of the interwar years, such material was popular among right-wing radical Germans. By the time Himmler attained his degree in 1922, he was a fanatic nationalist. In August of 1923, Himmler joined the Nazi Party, idolizing the party's leader Adolf Hitler. Himmler quit his job and devoted his career to the party. November 9th of 1923, Himmler marched alongside Hitler, Ernest Röhm, and German Göring, and other Nazi leaders in the beer hall putsch. The failed coup placed Hitler temporarily in jail, and Himmler found work building his reputation within the Nazi Party. He gave many speeches that followed themes of the German race, the need for German expansion, and the struggles against the enemies of Germany. In 1929, Hitler appointed Himmler Reichsführer of the Schutzstaffel SS. At the time, the SS served as bodyguards for Hitler and other top Nazi leaders. As the newly appointed leader of the SS, Himmler sought to develop an elite faction of the Nazi Party. In 1929, the SS totaled 280 men, and by the time the Nazis came to power in 1933, Himmler had grown the SS to 52,000. Himmler inducted two new functions for the SS: internal security and guardianship over racial purity. In 1931, Himmler established the Sicherheitsdienst Security Service, or SD, to gather intelligence and monitor opponents within the Nazi Party, leaders of other political parties, and government officials. In 1934, the SD was distinguished as the sole political intelligence agency for Germany. 5 years later, in September of 1939, Himmler fused the SD with the Reich Security Main Office. Following the Nazis' invasion of Poland in 1939, Hitler appointed Himmler as the Reich Commissar for the strengthening of the German ethnic stock. This new position authorized Himmler and the SS to have complete control over German resettlement in areas of occupied Poland and eventually the Soviet Union in 1941. Himmler had complete say over who was German, where ethnic Germans should live, and which population should be moved out or destroyed to make room for resettled Germans. Himmler's plan for resettlement would be conducted with the help of the Einsatzgruppen, known as the SS Mobile Killing Units. The Einsatzgruppen was taken to initiate and partake in mass murder of Jews, government officials, Roma, and people with disabilities, no matter the age or gender. So he committed all of these atrocities. Now, here's the creepy thing about this, is that when you look up the surname Himmler genealogy, the vast majority of Argentine Jews are descended from immigrants who arrived from Europe. They say that this is where the Nazis escaped from Germany and went down to Argentina. And actually, this is where Pope Francis is from. And in Expedition Unknown, Josh Gates showed that there was a lot of evidence that Hitler himself may have faked his death and gone to Argentina. They found a huge cache of Hitler's personal effects. It says these Ashkenazic Jews migrated from small towns or shechtas of Poland, Lithuania, Russia, Germany, Romania, or Ukraine, leaving behind most of their Jewish relatives. After 2 or 3 generations, those Jewish families lost track of their relatives, having been saved from the war, immigrated to other countries like USA, England, or Australia. It says there are Jewish families in Argentina with the surname Himmler. And in the Jewish cemetery of La Tablada, Buenos Aires, and that's where the Nazis went, that escaped, is buried some people with this name Himmler. And it is a Jewish surname. And I could go on with... So there were a number of top German officials that were actually of Jewish origin that participated with the Nazi Party. And they are now saying that the government there in Israel has neo-Nazi ministers in it. And now you can understand why Israel Ariel would say that all of these people need to die who don't, he says, ask them if they obey the 7 Noahide laws, and if they say no, kill them. That is their future plan for the whole world. And not only for Christians and Islamic people, but for anyone that's Jewish that doesn't follow their dictates. So it's really an evil regime with the Sanhedrin having some of these people in it. Now, there was information that I saw that linked George Bush's grandfather to raising funds for the Nazi Party. And I won't go into that history, but I'm just telling you there are people in the current situation that helped along with 9/11 to bring down America. And there's something else I want to say about this, but I think I'll wait until the next video to discuss that. Then we had HAARETZ posted this story. Historian, Nazi army included 150,000 of Jewish descent. Berlin, as many as 150,000 men of Jewish descent served in the German military under Adolf Hitler, some with the Nazi leaders' explicit consent. A U.S. historian who has interviewed hundreds of former soldiers said on Thursday, Brian Mark Rigg, a history professor at the American Military University in Virginia, told Reuters that the issue of soldiers' partial Jewish descent was long a somewhat taboo subject, overlooked by most academics as it threw up thorny questions. Now here's the thing. You always hear the Jews saying 6 million Jews died, and then that's all you hear, and they build all these museums to honor the 6 million Jews that died. But did you know that millions more people that were non-Jews died as well in the concentration camps? And they were treated horribly and perished in the same ways the Jews did, but the Jews don't acknowledge the Gentiles at all. They're just worthy to be forgotten. And I find this very disgusting that they never include them in the Holocaust memorials. Not everybody who wore a uniform was a Nazi, and not every person of Jewish descent was persecuted, he said. Where do they belong? They served in the military, but lost mom at Auschwitz. According to the Nuremberg laws of 1935, Jews or those of partial or Jewish descent were unfit for military service, but Rigg tracked down and interviewed more than 400 former soldiers of partial Jewish descent labeled Mischlinge, half-caste, by the Nazis. Now, it turns out Rigg found out that he had Jewish ancestry, so he's not a Gentile, projecting this on the Jewish people. He is a Jew. He estimates there were about 60,000 soldiers with one Jewish parent and 90,000 with a Jewish grandparent in the Wehrmacht, the regular army as distinct from the Nazi SS. They thought, if I serve well, they're not going to hurt me and not going to hurt my family. However, on returning home from the campaign in Poland at the start of the war, to find persecution of their families worsening, many soldiers classified as half-Jewish started to complain, prompting Hitler to order their dismissal in 1940. But many of these so-called half-Jewish soldiers continued to serve, sometimes due to delays in the discharge order reaching the front, because they concealed their background or because they applied and won clemency for good service. Many senior officers with Jewish ancestry won special permission to serve from Hitler himself. You never hear this in history books. History is not so black and white. History about Mischlinge shows how bankrupt the Nazi racial laws were, said Rigg. Sensitive subject, and while Germany has long been aware of men serving as soldiers who Nazi race laws should have classified as Jewish, most notably former Chamberlain Helmut Schmidt And Rigg, who served in the U.S. Marines and as a volunteer in the Israeli army, was moved to research the subject after he discovered his own Jewish ancestry while probing his family tree, and after a chance meeting with a Jewish Wehrmacht veteran. Many of his subjects were telling their story for the first time, and in some cases their families knew nothing of their Jewish heritage. They would talk their hearts out, telling me all about this schizophrenic story they went through, he said. He's convinced that most of the soldiers of Jewish descent were not aware of the Nazi systematic murder of Jews, noting that most half-Jews reported to deportation stations in 1944. Most say they do not feel guilty about serving in the military. They feel guilty about what they didn't do to save their relatives. The LA Times wrote this back in 1996, The Jews in Hitler's Military. London, sustained by scholarship, peanut butter, and a sense of mission, American Brian Rigg is exploring the eerie and uncharted no man's land of Holocaust history. Rigg interviews former German soldiers of Jewish heritage, some of them high-ranking officers who fought for Adolf Hitler's Third Reich in World War II during the Holocaust, when the Nazis slaughtered 6 million Jews and millions of non-Jews. Thousands of men of Jewish descent and hundreds of what the Nazis called full Jews serving in the military with Hitler's knowledge. The Nazis allowed these men to serve, but at the same time exterminated their families, Rigg said. On a heady journey of personal and professional discovery, the 25-year-old Texan has talked with more than 300 of these veterans, including a handful in California, passed along from one old soldier to another. He has crisscrossed Germany for 4 years, often by bicycle, sometimes sleeping in railroad stations to stretch his budget. Rigg said he has documented the Jewish ancestry of more than 1,200 of Hitler's soldiers, including 2 field marshals and 10 generals, men commanding up to 100,000 troops. In about 20 cases, soldiers of Jewish heritage were awarded the Knight's Cross, Germany's highest military honor, he said. This is totally shocking. Rigg, who graduated Yale in '96, arrived at England's Cambridge University to begin a graduate degree in history, lugging his clothes, computer, and documentation in a bulging knapsack. Jonathan Steinberg, a Cambridge historian, read Rigg's files and hurried to find a safe place for them. Steinberg's Jewish, of course. When I saw Brian's archive, I could not believe it. He's like the sorcerer's apprentice, calling these sources up from the depths. People keep coming and coming to him, Steinberg said. I guess what we are dealing with psychologically is people who have felt guilty all these years. All classic, all American boy comes along and they open up to him. Along the way, Rigg, who is of German extraction and was raised as a Protestant, has discovered that he too has Jewish ancestry. Like many of the families he has visited, Rigg had distant relatives who were killed for being Jewish and others who died fighting in battle for Nazi Germany. The old soldiers give Rigg both documents and their stories of war, peace, and suffering. He says many will struggle with questions that a challenge to history. This challenge to history. If I fought in the German army while my mother died in a Nazi concentration camp, am I a villain or a victim? The focus of Rigg's research are so-called Mischlinge, Germans who were classified as Jewish by the Nazis because of their parentage and who face proscriptions under Nazi racial laws, even though most did not consider themselves Jews. It is an ugly word, Rigg says. For the Nazis, it stood for mongrels, hybrids, bastards. They fit neither in Hitler's Aryan Germany nor in the large community of observant German Jews he targeted for annihilation. Many of the men Rigg meets cling to Nazi terminology, describing themselves as half Jewish, half German. Sometimes they weep as they reminisce. These Germans now in their 70s and 80s, many of whom killed on the battlefield for a monstrous regime, while their families were being killed by it. In many cases, these men have not talked about it for 50 years. Then I come, it is as if they have opened up a coffin that they thought they buried so long ago. It all comes out, Rigg said. One of his discoveries was a 1944 German Army personnel document listing 77 high-ranking officers of mixed Jewish race or married to a Jew. 2 generals, 8 lieutenant generals, 5 major generals, and 23 colonels are on that list. If it ever occurred to anybody to go to a general's personnel file to see if he was Jewish, said Steinberg at Cambridge. Hitler personally signed declarations for all 77 on the 1944 list, asserting that they were of German blood, thereby exercising his right of exception under 1935 Nazi legislation that barred anyone with Jewish grandparent from becoming an officer. Deciding exactly who was to be classified a Jew stirred great internal debate among Nazi leaders. Hitler loathed Jews, but he also needed experienced commanders and fighters. What's fascinating is how involved Hitler was in the screening process, Rigg said. At the height of the war, he was personally deciding whether this private or that should be of German blood, a private. By Hitler's command, any soldier asking for a declaration of German blood had to submit a complex application, including photos of his head and body and skull measurements. He would look at these photographs for a long time and decide whether this guy was worthy to be an Aryan, Rigg said. He said there were at least a dozen exception lists approved by Hitler, naming ranking officials not only in the armed forces but in the civilian administration that worked with the military. One German civilian of Jewish heritage was in charge of key factories in the tank-making industry, he said. World War II historians have written about these men in passing, but Rigg's research is yielding new breadth and depth and chilling detail. A German officer in uniform visiting his Jewish father in Sachsenhausen concentration camp in 1942. Mothers begging Nazi officials to accept that the real fathers of their sons were Christian lovers, not their Jewish classified husbands. When Brian proposed this project, I told him there were anomalies in all wars, and this one was not worth tracking down, said Yale historian Henry Ashby Turner. But he went on with incredible perseverance, drawn by the people and the poignancy of their stories. I never imagined there were that many people, particularly that many officers. In interviews and research in Germany this month, Rigg still found more Wehrmacht officers of Jewish descent and more than 1,500 pages of documents, both from veterans and their families and from the wartime German archives that Rigg explores with these people's consent. The Nazi regime reeked of hypocrisy. Rigg's new research makes plain. He documents the case of Field Marshal Erhard Milch, deputy to the Luftwaffe Chief Hermann Göring. Long rumored to have been Jewish, Milch, in fact, had a Jewish father, which according to Nazi code made him unacceptable to serve in the armed forces. But in 1935, Rigg's research shows Göring, Hitler's chosen successor, falsified documents to declare Milch of Aryan descent by asserting that his mother's brother was really his father. Rigg has also brought to light folklore surrounding the daring do rescue by German soldiers of Rigg has also brought to light folklore surrounding the daring do rescue by German soldiers of Rabbi Joseph Schneerson, the leader of ultra-Orthodox Lubavitcher Jews, who was trapped in Warsaw when the war began in 1939. Schneerson was spirited to safety after an appeal to Germany by then neutral United States. Lubavitcher tradition says the Rebbe was saved by a German Jew. Rigg has identified him as bayonet-scarred. Bemedaled Major Ernest Bloch was one of the officers who won a coveted declaration. that said, "I, Adolf Hitler, leader of the German nation, approve Major Ernest Bloch to be of German blood. However, after the war, Ernest Bloch will be re-evaluated to see if he's still worthy to have such a title." Bloch was eventually promoted to colonel, but he was dismissed in 1944, along with other high-ranking officers of Jewish heritage. About 100,000 Jews served in the German army in World War I, and about 12,000 of them were killed. Veterans thought their service would protect them against the Nazi crackdown early in World War II, Rigg said. And when the transports came to pick them up for deportation, they came out in uniforms with their medals. Some of them even went to the gas chamber with their medals. In 1940, Jews and those of mixed ancestry with 2 Jewish grandparents were expelled from the armed forces. Those from the latter groups lived as civilians for 4 years. Impotent witnesses as Jewish families, sometimes their families, were wiped out by deportations. Many of them lost relatives in the Holocaust and knew that they had been sent to Auschwitz or other camps. Yet in 1944, when these men themselves got postcards ordering them to report to a certain train station for deportation, most of them went, Rigg said. If they really knew what happened to their parents and grandparents, why did they go? Initial reports of Rigg's findings, published in London, have triggered spirited debate among historians. There has been applause for the young American's dogged quest, but also sharp criticism. David Cesarani, professor of modern European Jewish history at Southampton University, said that beyond the volume of the research and the intimate details of particular cases, there is little new in Rigg's work, and it is fundamentally incorrect, he maintained, to approach the soldiers as Jews. So they're trying to deny it, and yet it's very clear. I've gotten letters and phone calls from kids and grandkids of these people saying, "Thank God you've come. Now our daddy or grandfather will talk to us about all of this," he said. The Times of Israel wrote, when Hitler was popular as a Jewish name in New York, in 1933, more than 30 families across the city bore the surname of the man who became the leader of the Nazi Party. And this was written also by a Jewish person, Gabe Friedman, in 1917. So, to me, hearing what Israel Ariel, the head of the Temple Institute, said about killing people, you know, if they don't obey this Talmudic idea of the Noahide laws, then he wants to kill all these people. So, where did his ancestry go back to? If Schneerson was part of that situation. And HAARETZ, as I said, also posted on Twitter, Israel's government has neo-Nazi ministers. It really does recall Germany in 1933. Adolf Hitler, 1889 to 1945, is unquestionably the central figure in the story of the Holocaust. It was the combination of his virulent hatred of Jews and his success in creating a political movement that was able to seize control of Germany that made the campaign to exterminate the Jews possible. But Hitler's origins. Hitler was born in a small town in Austria in 1889, and he was the son of a local customs official and his much younger third wife. Hitler's father was an illegitimate child. Anyway, I'm just bringing all of this history together, and there was a study that suggests Adolf Hitler had Jewish and African ancestors. Adolf Hitler may have had Jewish and African ancestors according to a recent DNA study by Belgian researchers. And this is something that the History Channel reported by Jenny Cohen. So she's a Jewish woman, and this was 2010. In the decades since Adolf Hitler's death, the Nazi leader's ancestry has been a subject of rampant speculation and intense controversy. Some have suggested that his father, Alois, born to an unwed woman named Maria Schicklgruber, was the illegitimate child of Leopold Frankenberger, a young Jewish man whose family employed her as a maid. She subsequently married Johann Georg Hiedler, later spelled Hitler, whose surname her son adopted. Others have claimed that Alois's biological father was also the grandfather of Hitler's mother, Clara Posey, making Adolf the product of an incestuous marriage. To unravel the mystery of the Führer's roots, the Belgian journalist Jean-Paul Mulders teamed up with Mark Vermeuren, a historian who has written extensively about Hitler and his ancestors. The duo collected saliva samples from 39 of the infamous dictator's living relatives. I had no idea he even had any relatives alive, including a great-nephew, Alexander Stuart Houston, who lives in New York, and an Austrian cousin identified only as Norbert H. Tests were then conducted to reveal the sample's principal hagiogroups, which are sets of chromosomes that geneticists use to define specific populations. Writing in the Flemish language magazine Knack, Mulders reported that the relatives' most dominant hagiogroup, known as E1b1b, is rare in Western Europeans, but most common among North Africans, and particularly the Berber tribes of Morocco, Algeria, Libya, and Tunisia. It's also one of the major founding lineages of the Jewish population, present in 18 to 20% of Ashkenazi Jews and 8.16 to 30% of Sephardic Jews. In other words, Hitler's family tree may have included Jewish and African ancestors. The tragic irony of the discovery is, of course, is that Hitler's Nazi regime systematically wiped out an estimated 2/3 of Europe's Jewish population between 1933 and 1945. 2/3. I have always been told by all these pastors it was only 1/3, and next time it'll be 2/3. But if the 2/3 was already wiped out, then where are we in the prophetic scope of things? Because that is in a prophecy in Zechariah that 2/3 of them will die. People of African descent were also considered enemies of the Aryans, whose supposed racial purity and superiority were central to the Mein Kampf author's lethal rhetoric. So what do we see with this Sanhedrin is a superiority mentality. When they put their king on the throne, you could see how he could just say, I'm God, worship me. Because if they think that they're superior, a lot of these kings in the past thought that they were gods, and they made people bow down and worship them. So I can see how that falls right into place. But as Mulders put it in the Knack article, one can, from this, postulate that Hitler was related to people whom he despised. As part of its continuing quest to pin down the Führer's heritage, Knack hopes to conduct DNA tests on a jawbone fragment and piece of blood-stained cloth retrieved from the Berlin bunker where Hitler allegedly committed suicide. The Russian government has held these artifacts in its archives since 1948 and continues to vouch for their authenticity despite a contradictory 2009 study by American scientists. Well, as I said, in Expedition Unknown, Josh Gates went down to Argentina. Behind this wall were these huge Nazi statues, and there was a pair of magnifying glasses that actually belonged to Hitler there. And there was a picture of Hitler holding the magnifying glass with the magnifying glasses case. So there was a lot of expensive silver statuary treasure that was hidden behind a wall, and some of it seemed to be the personal effects of even Hitler himself. But Since the publication of the NAC article on August 18th of 2010, academics have been quick to point out that this does not necessarily mean the man who inspired the Holocaust was either Jewish, African, or a combination of the two. The E1B1B hagiogroup runs in other ethnic groups, for instance, and DNA analysis remains an inexact science. But one thing about this study's results is certain. As Ronnie DeCorte, a geneticist interviewed by NAC, remarked, Hitler would not have been pleased. And on Expedition Unknown, they seem to show a real secluded area where they thought that Hitler himself may have even come to flee from Germany, when he knew he was losing. And in Argentina, hid on this specific island that had a house, and they actually went there and showed the interior of it. So, nevertheless, there's this superiority attitude that the rest of the Jews who, the Sanhedrin doesn't deem worthy, are worthy to be in a Holocaust, is what he said. He said that there needed to be a Holocaust again, basically, for those people. If they didn't come to Israel and they don't participate, blah, blah, blah. This superiority, that God chose them and that they're superior over all the other races is something that the Nazis perpetrated. They wanted the Aryan race to be like gods. And guess what? You've had Yuval Noah Harari saying that they can become gods. They want to put a chip under your skin. And so there is that Aryan idea right there in Israel as we speak. So you obviously had Jews fighting against Jews. And I believe this is how it's going to be in the future. They're already fighting their women at the Western Wall who want to pray with the Torah scroll. They want to imprison them for 2 years or something crazy. 6 months to 2 years for, bringing a prayer shawl or, wearing phylacteries or having a Torah scroll or singing or, and if you'll do that to your own women, then what does that say about you? You are not a light to the nations. That's what it says to me. And the only one who ever was a light to the nations was Jesus Christ, the King of Kings, the King of Israel, that the Sanhedrin wanted crucified. So they didn't want their king. They don't want the hope of eternal life, and they are still in their sins because they reject the blood of the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. He did a sacrifice once and for all with his own living eternal blood of God's covenant. And they are going to reinstate this blood covenant with many, thinking they're going to purify all the Jewish people in the world from their sins, and it's just a big fat lie. So let's hope that they wake up and see the truth. But, you've heard that another Holocaust is coming, and in the words of this Sanhedrin rabbi, it sure does sound like that's their plan. Even this Jewish man, David Sheen, that recorded the Sanhedrin meeting where they were saying all of this stuff about, killing the Christians and killing the Muslims and, the genocide of killing their own Jewish people. So there's only just like this little remnant of them left. It seems like that is the plan. So some of these people may have been their ancestors that fought with Hitler's army, for all we know. I think that they're going to gain power as kings with the king when he appoints them as the legal Sanhedrin, which the king will implement the Christocracy, which is the elevation of the judges in Israel, under his rule as king under a theocracy. That's what they're even saying is happening. And I was saying this before I ever knew anything in the news about any of that happening, because the Lord was revealing it through the Holy Spirit from Revelation. And I shared every bit of it. So anyway, let's just add this to the mix and see what you think about this. Like, subscribe, and share. Get the algorithms going. And please support my work and my channel. It's really discouraging if nobody cares. Maybe 2 or 3 people care, and that's it. Out of 12,635 or 65, whatever it is now. So all the hindrances going on with YouTube, and it's just crazy. Anyway, I will see you in the next video. These are important things that people need to know, facts of history.